Welcome to the first NAIOP event of 2020. My name is Christopher Thompson. I'm Executive Managing Director of Industrial Brokerage with Cushman & Wakefield. I have the honor of being the president of the South Florida NAIOP chapter this year. The South Florida NAIOP chapter continues to be the shining example for other chapters of NAIOP nationally. This organization staying at this high level during COVID is directly attributable to the leadership of my predecessors, Stephanie and Ryan, the hard work of Jules and Alba, and the support of our sponsors to make great programs like this happen. So I will take a moment to introduce our sponsors, and you will see them scrolling across the screen. Diamond sponsor, Truist. Emerald sponsor, Duke Realty, Prologis. Ruby sponsor, BBX Industrial, Butters, Centerpoint Properties, Colliers International South Florida, Go Tilt Construction, Marcus & Millichap, TCRE. Sapphire sponsors, Adler Group, Ackerman LLP, Balfour Beatty, Berger Commercial Realty, Brody & Associates, Buchanan, Ingersoll & Rooney, PC, CBRE, Coronet, Current Builders, Cushman & Wakefield, Excel Construction, First Point Advisors, First Onsite, Janae Property Group, Graham's Company, Grover Corlew, Itasca Construction Associates, JLL, Keller Augusta, Miller Construction Company, Miramar Park of Commerce, Parkway, Pearson Grant, Risk Strategies Company, South State Bank, Stiles, Universal Engineering Sciences, Workspace Property Trust. Thank you again to all of them. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing this panel for the NAIOP South Florida Economic Outlook 2022, the pandemic-hardened economy. Our moderator is Darcy Lunsford. Darcy is Executive Vice President and Director of Office Leasing for Butters Realty and Management. Darcy is one of the most well-known people in the South Florida commercial real estate market. She started her career in journalism down here, reporting on real estate and the economy. In 2011, Darcy made the leap into brokerage and hasn't looked back. She is an active member of NAIOP and has served as our president for this chapter in 2019 and for the state in 2021. Mark Vittner will be giving us an overview of the economy. Mark is Managing Director and Senior Economist for Wells Fargo Corporate and Investment Bank, where he is responsible for the U.S. and regional economic conditions tracking. He writes weekly for the department's reports and is often featured in Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and many other publications. Originally from Atlanta, Mark earned a BBA in economics from, as he wants me to say, the national champion University of Georgia, and an MBA from the University of North Florida. Rebecca Rocky will be giving us a perspective on the commercial real estate market. Rebecca is a global head of economics, analysis, and forecasting for Cushman & Wakefield. In her role, she studies how economics, demographics, financial markets, and commercial real estate interact both at the macro and micro levels. Before her role at Cushman & Wakefield, she worked as a consultant engineering models to forecast loss reserves for the Fannie Mae. She is frequently cited in the media, guest lecturer at NYU, and is an NYC, OMB, and DC Policy Center advisor. She triple majored in economics, French, and international business at Stephanie Rodriguez's favorite school, Penn State University, and a master's in applied economics from Johns Hopkins University. Darcy, I will pass the baton on to you now.
Well, good morning, South Florida commercial real estate world. Welcome to the year 2022. Feels a lot like 2021, right? But thank you all for hanging in there with us for another year, another surge, and another virtual event. But this one is going to be the Mac Daddy of programs, I promise you that. It's a double hitter of economic forecasting rock stars that are coming to your screen. So, to all my friends and fellow CRE professionals out there in the virtual audience, a huge welcome to NAIOP South Florida's Economic Outlook 2022, the Pandemic Hardened Economy. I'm Darcy Lunsford, Vice President of Butters Realty and Management. I'm also past president of NAIOP South Florida, NAIOP Florida, and current board members for both our local and state chapters. So, the diabolical Omicron scrambled our plans to return to NAIOP's traditional Grin and Grip Power Breakfast event. But it did not and cannot deter us from our mission to bring you insights from the brightest economic minds in the whole entire country. The pandemic also did not deter NAIOP from its critical mission to promote the best industry practices and advocate for reasonable government regulations. Here's a fun fact. You are all part of an industry that is a vital economic juggernaut for Florida and its family. The commercial real estate sector pumps $28 billion a year into Florida's economy and supports nearly 250,000 jobs. And NAIOP is watching out for you and our valuable industry cluster by bringing home key legislative wins. Chief among them is the continued reduction of the business rent tax. Florida is the only state in the nation to charge sales tax on commercial leases. NAIOP pushed for and helped deliver legislation to enforce the internet sales tax, thereby generating a new revenue stream for the state of Florida. This will allow the business rent tax to soon be slashed by $1 billion a year. NAIOP also won further concessions from the state legislature to push the deadline for installation of those expensive bi-directional antenna systems out to 2025. These signal boosting systems, while certainly well-intentioned to help emergency crews, place an unreasonable cost burden on developers and may soon be antiquated and ineffective due to new construction and technology. Now, pivoting back to today's Economic Outlook program, we're going to start our program with a NAIOP fan favorite, Mark Vittner, Senior Economist for Wells Fargo, who will illuminate us on the macroeconomic forces and trends that will dominate the 2022 business cycle. He will be followed by Rebecca Rocky, Global Head of Forecasting for Cushman & Wakefield, who will drill down into what all this means for the commercial real estate sector, nationally and regionally. Now, I'm going to ask you guys to please keep your microphones on mute during the presentations, but afterwards, we will have some time for Q&A. So use that Ask Question function anytime during presentations to type in a question for either one of our economists. We will take your questions at the end. All right, Mark Vittner, I'm tossing the program over to you.
I was hoping that we were going to be done with all this, and I'm still traveling, even with the Omicron. We still have some live events. I'm headed to Dallas. I called him to make sure, and in typical Dallas fashion, I said, "Are we going to be live tomorrow? Or am I going to do this through Zoom?" And he said, "We're going to be live." I said, "You sure?" He goes, "Oh, hell yeah." So, Texas is still going strong. So, all travel hasn't stopped. From what I can tell from the numbers, it looks to me like Omicron peaked in Florida around the 11th, so almost 10 days ago, and will probably bottom around the middle of February. It'll probably be back down to where it was in the pre-Omicron level if we don't see some other kind of variant come up and about. As it is, the emergence of Omicron did slow the economy. Late last year, we had a very disappointing retail sales report. That wasn't the headline. It was a little misleading because sales were up so much in October because everybody was told that there was nothing on the store shelves. So they went out and shopped early. And so sales were at a high level and they didn't rise as much from November to December as they usually do. In terms of our GDP forecast, we did trim it down a little bit for 2022 because we reduced the fourth quarter growth. So we're coming off a lower base. but we're still pretty strong. I mean, we've got real GDP rising last year around 5.5% in 2021. In 2022, we're looking for about 4% overall growth. I'd say the consensus is around 3.3%. When I look at our forecast versus some others, I think what folks are missing is we're likely to see a much larger rebuild of inventories this year. And production is gearing up in a really big way in the US. And one of the big differences between 2022 and 2021 is that production is going to be growing faster than consumption. So we're going to be building inventories. Now, inflation is going to be problematic. I don't believe any of this nonsense that supply chain disruptions are the reason that we have inflation. Supply chain disruptions are a byproduct of inflation. The reason we have inflation is we had an incredibly expansive fiscal policy that provided between $5 and $6 trillion in relief to the pandemic, which was very well intended, but that expansive fiscal policy was accommodated by a very expansive monetary policy, and that has created inflation. And I studied at the University of Georgia under Richard Timberlake, who one of Milton Friedman's top students. Inflation is a monetary phenomena, and what you learn in monetary economics is that is the worst possible policy framework from an inflation standpoint. And I don't think inflation has peaked. It's at 7% year to year. I think we will see a brief period of double-digit inflation this year where inflation gets up to 10 or 11% and then begins to subside. The supply chain disruptions are a byproduct of inflation, and they do kind of reinforce the cycle a little bit, sort of like a wage price spiral. We should see some moderation in supply chain disruptions toward the end of this year, but supply chains are not likely to normalize and get back to where they were pre-COVID until we have another recession, which probably isn't for several years down the road. But supply chain disruptions are going to be with us for some time. One of the things that happens in a high inflation economy is that people move from high cost parts of the country to lower cost parts of the country. Housing makes up somewhere between 1/3 and 40% of what people spend their after-tax income on. And if you have no real income growth, which we haven't had any real income growth over the last year, in fact, real after-tax income fell by more over the last year than it did during the financial crisis. And but if you have no real income growth, one way you can boost your standard of living is from moving to New York to South Florida. Because while South Florida is still more expensive than Central Florida, it's a heck of a lot cheaper than New York is. And so what we've seen is an accelerated migration from high cost parts of the country to lower cost parts of the country. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you leave a metro area. You may move from areas closer into the city to the suburbs, or from the suburbs to the outer suburbs. But we are seeing an accelerated affordability migration that is likely to continue. While the US had the slowest population growth that it's seen since we began tracking population, migration was the highest it's been in about 15 years. So we've seen an acceleration in the movement of folks within the United States, and Florida has been the biggest recipient. We've had the strongest net migration. In terms of the policy mix this year, it's going to become less supportive of economic growth. I don't think Build Back Better is going to pass. They may come back and do a slimmed down version of the child care tax credit. The problem with Build Back Better is that if you assume that all of the programs continue for 10 years, which I've never done a federal government program that didn't continue after it's been put in place, the final cost was in excess of $5 trillion. And so it was about equal with the stimulus that's been put in place in the economy. There's just no way it would be inflationary. I mean, that would threaten to take the 10 to 11% inflation forecast that we have to 15 to 16%. And so there's just no way that was going to come in, because inflation hurts the poor more than it hurts anyone else. West Virginia is a state that has a lot of poor and lower middle income households. And that was Joe Manchin's big push against Build Back Better. I seriously doubt that it'll come back. On the Fed side, we're expecting the Fed to raise interest rates 4 times this year. There's a lot of talk in the financial markets that maybe they'll go by 0.5 point in their first move in March. I kind of doubt it. The markets are already pretty jittery. We would have to see the financial markets really settle down, and it's certainly possible. That's when they'll end QE. We also expect them to start reducing the size of their balance sheet during the second half of this year. And the pace of rate hikes is probably going to be 4 this year, 3 or 4 next year. I think that what's different is that most folks assume that the Fed would stop at around 2.25, somewhere below 2.5%. And that's where folks think the long-term funds rate is. I think they're likely to stop around 3% or maybe somewhere between 3 and 3.5%, but we're not likely to get there until 2025. So the rate cycle may be a little bit longer and may result in slightly higher interest rates, but I don't know that, in the scheme of things, those are still relatively low rates. And at that level, when they, where they top out, that's where the curve will flatten. So long-term rates probably don't go any higher than somewhere between 3 and 3.5%, but that's higher than the markets currently have. I'm gonna go through the charts pretty quickly. I wanted to cover a lot of ground. I want to make sure I got plenty of time for Rebecca as well. So this is just the recent trends in COVID. You can see that cases have topped out all over the country, and they're headed lower. Some states have not, where I'm going this afternoon. Texas, still seeing cases trend higher. On the left-hand side is a comparison of the number of deaths per 100,000 in the United States, Europe, and Asia. And the dashed lines across the top are the number of deaths per 100,000 from heart disease, from cancer, and the bottom dashed line is from accidents of all types. And we were trending down to that level. As we trend down to that level of accidents of all types, folks begin to worry less about COVID and tend to venture out more. We should see that number trend down. It lags a little bit from the daily new cases, but it'll start trending down, I believe, somewhere in mid-February, and we'll see that. And as that comes down this spring, we should see folks return to their regular post-COVID activities. As it is right now, fewer people are traveling, shouldn't have to wait long to get through the TSA line. We're seeing that fewer people are going out to restaurants. Looking at the open table data, I love to show people the comparison between New York and Florida. You can see how folks in Florida have been much more willing to go out and engage in economic activities than folks in New York, which is mainly a business city. I happen to believe that Florida did an excellent job in balancing the risk from COVID with balancing the risk to the economy. It's been borne out by the influx of people moving to Florida, an influx of businesses moving to the state. In terms of overall economic growth, I'm concerned about inflation from a monetary standpoint. This chart shows you why you could be concerned about it from a Keynesian standpoint. Actual GDP will be above its potential by the end of 2022. At no time in the history of this country has inflation decelerated when actual GDP has been above its potential. It has never happened before. Now, there'll be some folks in the background because I think I've got the Minute Maids scheduled to come today, and they're coming right now. So just bear with me as they come into the house. In terms of consumer confidence, the Florida Consumer Sentiment Index has tracked the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index very well. There's been a real split between that measure of consumer confidence and the Conference Board's measure of consumer confidence. The difference is that in the Florida measure and the University of Michigan measure, those surveys ask folks a lot more about their finances and their purchasing plans. And oddly enough, the proportion of people that say that now is a good time to buy a home is actually about half what it was at the worst of the financial crisis. So even though home builder confidence is at its 5th highest level ever, the proportion of folks who think it's a good time to buy a home is at its lowest or near its lowest level ever. Overall consumer confidence from the Conference Board is very high, however, at 115.8, because the job market is incredibly strong. I'm going to speed this back up again here. And in terms of the supply chain disruptions, people wonder what happened and inflation. This chart explains it very well. The blue line is the real consumption of goods in the economy. And you can see how much it took off as the relief checks were provided and the economy reopened, how much it's above its trend. The red line is the production of consumer goods in the US economy. Now, the difference is made up by a reduction in inventories and an increase in exports. The volume of exports, increase in imports. The volume of imports coming through our ports in the United States is 27% higher than it was prior to the pandemic. And that's why we have the port congestion that we have. And this is why I say that supply chain disruptions are a byproduct of higher inflation. They're not the cause of it. Supply chain disruptions were lessening before Omicron. Now we have this heat map that we publish each month. Red is bad, green is good. And you can see that it was beginning to lighten up in November and December. And before Omicron, I was saying, I think we were at peak supply chain disruption. I now think that that's coming back a little bit. And with Omicron and with the ports being shut down in China, I'm afraid that we'll see that we'll relapse a little bit. And even when things were getting better, we were saying that it was going to take a long time to get back to pre-COVID levels, probably not until the next recession. We're seeing that delivery times were lessening somewhat, and traffic was following its regular seasonal pattern, although in December we were above where we were in 2020. I'd mentioned that the proportion of consumers that feel it's a good time to buy a home is near its lows. It has improved a little bit. It did improve a little bit in January. It's up to 41%. But you can see that at the lows of the financial crisis, it was around 60%. A big part of that is because of the surge in home prices and affordability, and also just the lack of homes that are available. Inflation concerns are pretty much top of mind among consumers. If you look at home price increases, Tampa and Miami are right there near the top, and Phoenix is up there as well. Many of the markets that have seen rapid home price appreciation tend to have a disproportionate share of home sales going to investors. That's certainly true of Tampa, certainly true of Miami. It's certainly true of Phoenix, where about 1 in 3 homes are currently purchased by an investor. Looking at commercial vacancy rates, sharp plunge in apartment vacancy rates. We had the best year ever for apartment absorption across the country. Drop in retail vacancy rates, somewhat surprising, but with people working from home, they have more time to shop, and we've seen that, and they have more money with all the relief checks. Industrial vacancy rates, no surprise there. And office vacancy rates, that's this is based off of leased office space, not off of occupied office space, because a lot of people are not physically occupying the space that they're leasing because everybody's working from home. Commercial real estate prices have increased very rapidly. Cap rates are falling. That's probably going to come to an end shortly with interest rates headed back up. Prices are still appreciating, though. The rate of appreciation should slow a little bit. Real estate is a great inflation hedge. And you see that with some of the big funds raising lots of money to purchase income generating properties. But I do think that price appreciation will moderate this year. Rebecca's going to give you some more detail on the various food groups in real estate. But as I said, the apartment market, red hot. Tampa's seen the greatest appreciation in rents of any market in the country, followed by Atlanta, Charlotte, Austin, and then you see Miami with that steady improvement. Miami, New York, and Los Angeles have seen improvement in their apartment markets. San Francisco's seen improvement, and then it backslid a little bit. It's interesting. You look at the markets that are doing the best. They're seeing a huge influx of tech companies. I'd say that Austin has always been, it's the next San Francisco, but South Florida, Atlanta, Tampa are some of the fastest growing tech markets in the country. Lots of young people moving there and renting apartments. Quick snapshot of the industrial market. These are the national numbers. Very strong absorption, very low vacancy rates. sharp increase in rents. The retail market, you can see the correlation between retail sales and the demand for retail space and that drop and increase in absorption coinciding with the surge in sales. And then finally, the office market and this back to work barometer, which comes from Castle Systems. I don't know when we're going to go back to work. I kind of feel like on February 1st, we're so tired of COVID, unless there's another variant. I think we're just going to say that the pandemic's over and go back to work. But I don't know when official announcements are going to be made on that. But my sense is that we'll begin to see businesses encouraging folks to come back to the office this spring. Construction material prices rising rapidly, labor shortages, problem all over the country. Don't expect that to get much better, although I do think that as fears of COVID subside, we'll see more people return to the labor market. Wages are up much more than they've been. They are rising much faster than they did at any point during the last cycle. They're up the most in the restaurant industry, and the restaurant industry is having to find ways to provide more product with fewer workers. And a lot of folks that used to work in the hospitality industry are either working, they're working they're working as contract workers instead of working instead of delivering pizza, they're working at Uber Eats. Instead of working at restaurants, they're working as contract workers in warehouses. The reason why that shift occurred is that better pay and more flexibility of hours, and that's what people seem to want. And so it's gonna be very hard for the hospitality industry to compete with that. Just real quickly on the region, Florida's added back 91% of the jobs that it lost during the early stage of the lockdown. Nationally, we've added just back 83%. States that locked down the hardest and were the slowest to reopen, like California, New York, Illinois, New Jersey, they've tended to add back a smaller proportion of the jobs that they lost. The states that opened back the most quickly and didn't have a lot of exposure to tourism like Florida does, added back the most jobs. Utah's the big leader, Idaho, Arizona, and Texas all have added back more jobs than they lost, added more jobs than they lost during the onset of the pandemic. Here's the trend in Florida, which is we're still seeing very solid pace of hiring, adding over 50,000 jobs a month since the expanded federal unemployment claims program was ended. So we should see stronger job growth in Florida in 2022 than we did in 2021. Net migration led all states in the country. 221,000 more people moved to Florida than moved away, easily besting Texas. When you look at where job growth has been the strongest in Florida, it's been the financial sector, professional services, particularly the tech sector, which has been real strong in South Florida, real strong in Tampa, and real strong in the Space Coast. And Jacksonville is also a market that's seen a lot of tech growth. Job openings in Florida are at a record high. Expect that to continue. The leadership in job growth is moving back towards Central Florida. That's where the biggest gap is. And we've seen that tourism has come back there really strong. The theme parks did great over the holiday season, even in the midst of Omicron. Miami's had 6% job growth over the last year, or South Florida's had 6% job growth over the last year. And again, I think that job growth not in percentage terms, but in absolute terms, will be stronger in Florida this year than it was last year, and stronger in South Florida than it was last year. There's a good chance it'll take the entire year for us to get back at our pre-pandemic level. Most of the jobs that have yet to be recovered are in the leisure and hospitality sector. Unemployment rate in Florida is right around what it is nationally. In South Florida is right around what it is as in Florida, 4.7 and 4.5%. And on the last chart that I have here, one thing I really like to look at is the LinkedIn numbers on the number of LinkedIn, the share of LinkedIn members that moved to a metro area over the last year. It gives you an idea of where job seekers are moving. Austin, Sarasota, Nashville, Tampa, Jacksonville are your top 5 cities. And I think that it's borne out by all economic statistics. This LinkedIn data seems to match up very, very well. It's also more current than the domestic migration numbers. which still look very good. 3 of Florida's 6 large metro areas rank in the top 20. I think the reason why South Florida is not in there is it's a combined statistical area, and that's why it's not in that list. But I'm pretty sure West Palm and Fort Lauderdale would best Indianapolis and Oklahoma City. The last chart I have here is the CPI by metro area. Prices are rising slightly faster in South Florida than they are nationally. Most of the areas that are growing rapidly are seeing that inflation is rising very rapidly. Atlanta's number one, 9.8% inflation over the last year. Phoenix is 9.7. Tampa's numbers were 8%, but that's a November number. We'll get the January numbers in another month. And then we've got our forecast going forward. All our slides are going to be made available. And to kind of just sum it up in one quick sentence, we're looking for a pretty good year in 2022. We think that we'll add more jobs in Florida than we did in 2021. The mix of jobs is more heavily weighted toward professional services and technology. We have very strong growth in manufacturing and construction. A lot of that is in the Space Coast, but it's in other parts of the state that have a lot of exposure to aerospace, which is doing incredibly well. So let me stop there, and I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca.
Before we toss it over to Rebecca, Mark, I just want to reiterate that the slide presentation you're going to make available for us, and we can put it on the NAIOP website.
Yes.
Great. And then, folks, you heard it here first. February 1, Mark Vittner declares the pandemic over. So let's throw a heck of a party down here and do it Texas style, right?
Absolutely. That's a barbecue.
That's a barbecue, baby, with a little Pinot Grigio and beer, I hope. All right, I'm going to toss it over to Rebecca Rocky of Cushman & Wakefield, who's going to give us our next presentation. Rebecca, take it away.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Wonderful. So I'll go through, I think for the most part, I agree with Mark. We did something very unlike economists, which was we took a risk and actually did not share our content before the event today. So good news, since the economy and the employment outlook drive real estate, we're pretty much in agreement on most items related to the outlook. So I'm going to go through the outlook with a little bit of a macro, a little bit of a micro view on South Florida, put Florida also in perspective as a state. And I'm going to go through with a live, work, play sort of flow. And I sort of lump industrial into that play category as it's increasingly tied to the consumer segment. Let's see here. Okay, so Mark mentioned that it was sort of reported that it's kind of not a good time to buy, and consumers are in a very different place than builders are. And I think this chart on the left really kind of shows you a little bit about why. This is just showing you the number of metropolitan areas in the U.S. out of 383 that have seen at least 10% appreciation in home prices over the last year. Clearly exceeding anything we've observed before. I would just point out this is not a U.S. specific phenomena at all. This is happening around the world. I've also pulled out Canada, but you can look across the Western world especially, and you would see this, but also throughout Asia Pacific. And the reason I point this out is because as a residential sector, you cannot think about multifamily and single family rental without knowing what's going on in the broader single family residential market, which is the largest real estate asset class in the United States. So I think this is important because it's creating affordability issues. And just in the last few months, mortgage rates have gone up by anywhere from 80 to 100 basis points, depending on which data set you're looking at. I think one important phenomena that has occurred throughout 2020 and 2021, which Mark also alluded to, was that we had really just the slowest population and household formation numbers in 2020 ever. And when I say ever, that data goes back to about 1910. So that includes the world wars, and that includes the Great Depression. So coming out of the year really where we had essentially the worst population and household formation growth ever, we saw a huge surge. And what we also know is that surge in formation was driven by young households. In fact, the share of 18 to 32-year-olds who lived with their parents during the pandemic was also at a record high going back to 1910, so also inclusive of the World Wars and the Great Depression. As you can see here, amongst the leaders over the next decade in household formation, which is most germane, fueled by population growth, fueled by migration, and all of the things Mark talked about, you see our Florida markets, in addition to other Sunbelt and coastal tech cities, are really dominating the top numbers. Just to kind of put this in context, what this has meant and what this will increasingly mean is that rentership will still be supported by these forces and increasingly by the lack of affordability in the single family market. Nationally, we did have a record year. You can see that about 2.1 million units were absorbed compared to about 700,000 per year on average over a longer time span. We still think this year is going to be strong, but it's going to slow down as we head into next year on a national basis towards that average. By contrast, when you look at South Florida, right, our sort of average over long periods of time, and this data does, it goes back even further than what we have here, is about 12,000 units absorbed per year. 2021 was about, not quite 10 times that, but you can see just how exceptional this sort of ratio and scale up was in 2021 for South Florida, again, with a lot of those migratory forces impacting demand in the market. This year, we're still looking at 77,000 and next year 36. So, we're still looking at multiples of 5 to 6 and then 3 of what is normal over the next few years. Now, what we have seen, both as a result of sort of constraint and just sort of lags in the single family residential construction market, there has been a big shift on the developer side to wanting to build where we know we've underbuilt for the last decade while our residential sector deleveraged. So as we see, this is giving you a bit more of a medium-term perspective. So just note that this chart is showing you the next 5 years. And over that time span, what we think is that this record demand is going to ultimately be met with supply for the most part, with a little bit of a lag. So in Miami, we think things will balance out. As you look at other parts of the market, we think things may soften a little bit as supply does catch up to this demand. I think it's important to note that when you look at a market like Miami, for example, I mean, you're talking about coming off of or essentially staying at 2.5 to 3% vacancy rates in the multifamily sector, slightly higher in our other markets. All of our Florida markets are performing above the national average in terms of effective rent growth. So what this axis is showing you is where we will see the greatest rent pressure. And this is a CAGR. So this is a compound annual growth rate. So you're looking at 6, anywhere from 9 to 10, maybe even 11% growth rate on an annual basis in effective rents, which account for concessions. So this really points to, I think, an important theme we'll see later on, which is there will be a focus on income growth on the investor side because of this rising interest rate environment and the fact that cap rates really will be, bottoming out for the most part. Some compression here and there, but we really can't rely on and sustain the kinds of capital growth rates we've seen. That's going to be very true multifamily. Good news is the NOI side is looking pretty good. So there's been a lot of migration. Mark talked about it. We've studied it. And we also have kind of tracked how that migration has affected, just apartment demand throughout the country. But we also have looked at how it affects movement within cities and occupancy within cities and across cities. So what I'm referring to here on the left is when we look at the top metro areas that account for 3/4 of the U.S. population, we see that urban cores have more than fully recovered. Really, where we have not seen a full recovery, San Francisco is a standout, but really just a handful of larger, dense cities that have not made a full recovery. Even New York has made a full recovery, if you can believe it. So, this myth of urban cores being over, I think, is just that, a myth. But where we have seen the biggest improvements are in these suburban areas, right? We know that 90% of people who moved during the pandemic stayed in the exact same city and just moved to a different part of that city. In fact, most people stayed in the exact same county that they had lived in before the pandemic. There was an acceleration in one city to another, but that was still a minority of the migration that took place during the pandemic. A distributed workforce, this is kind of getting into just this movement of people, great reshuffling that occurred. And that has a lot of implications for how we think about office and the way that we work. We're clearly less tethered and less dependent on a physical location. But as I mentioned, most people stayed in the same city, and most office companies are saying, we want you to come back to the office. It's not going to be the same. It's going to look different. What you do here is going to be different. But that puts a bit of a radius on how far you can go. I mean, only so many people in the U.S. can afford to commute from South Florida back up to their New York office or something like that. Most people are going to be within, a reasonable drivable radius with a tolerance for higher commutes or longer commutes as a result of working more from home post-COVID. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of variation in this, but just survey after survey that we do, both from the start of the pandemic to today, tells us the exact same thing, which is what you see on the right here. Now, on the office side, more specifically, I just want to give you a sense of where this recovery is at. What the red bars show you are the decline from pre-COVID to the trough during the pandemic. The green is what has been made up through November, which is the latest data from BLS at a city level. And these, the gray dots are showing you how much we've recovered. I'll talk about the blue dots in a second. So a few things. One is nationally, we are flirting with. We are 1 or 2 months away from a full recovery in office jobs. But fortunately for Florida and many other Sunbelt markets, office employment have made a full recovery. That's true of Tampa and Jacksonville, Miami and West Palm Beach. Not so true in your harder hit Orlando, right? Very tourist centric. And we saw a larger than nationally observed correction in the office labor market there, as well as in Fort Lauderdale. So if we were to take this November number and add on the December and then the 2022 forecast, we would get this chart. So I'm just going to flip back and watch the arrows move all to the left here. So all of Florida, all this is saying is that it's going to outperform this year in terms of job growth. And while we don't see Orlando or Fort Lauderdale making that full recovery this year, they will be much further along in their stages of recovery. And of course, Tampa, Jacksonville, Miami, and West Palm Beach, even further above pre-COVID levels, both on a nominal and a relative basis. You can see, along with some Texas and other Sunbelt markets, you really are a leader. And it's always a competition, Florida and Texas, and you're sort of outranking Texas here. So I'll point out a few places where you do that in other segments as well. Unfortunately, what's been weird about office during the pandemic is that office jobs and office absorption have been disconnected. Fortunately, that relationship is healing, and we're seeing it happen first in the markets where office jobs have outperformed, also including in South Florida. So what I mean by that is office in the aggregate is still in a correction. Demand is still negative, vacancy is still rising, and there is still more to come. However, in Florida and South Florida more specifically, we have started to see absorption notch back up in parts of the market into positive territory, which is very good news. That's step one in a full-on demand recovery, and you're leading the nation. And Miami is also one of a handful of markets, and this is at the MSA level, so inclusive of Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach, one of a few markets where vacancy has fallen for the last 6 months. Nationally and in most markets, vacancy is still rising. So these are very positive dynamics. And when combined with a flight to quality that is actually resulting in bidding wars at the upper echelon of office product, this does lead most of our Florida markets to be at the top in rankings on a Class A rent growth basis over the next 5 years. So all of this is pointing to maybe some of the underlying nuances of the outlook, since I think sometimes there's a little clickbait or media focus on, the death of office and things like that. It's just much like the sort of myth around urban cores being over, which I showed you is very much not the case. Same with office. We're just seeing a tremendous appetite in high growth markets where we know occupiers want to be, and they're expanding following people who have migrated there. They're really going to benefit. So you see here both Tampa, Miami, West Palm Beach, very much near the top in terms of rent growth. As we shift to the sort of play element of the commercial real estate world, I just want to put industrial into context to start. E-commerce penetration into the broader retail market is going to slow. But that said, the shift that took place in 2020 is still with us and still impacting demand. 2020, demand was sort of restrained by the pandemic. So 2021 was a story of both incredible demand in real time as well as pent-up demand from last year. And in fact, national absorption exceeded 500 million square feet according to our data. And that's the first time it exceeded 500 million square feet. But it's also the first time it exceeded 400 million square feet. So it's just really a very hot environment. The cold snap in 2021, the supply chain issues, the pricing issues with inputs has really also dampened what we thought would hit the market in deliveries, which has pushed vacancy down even further. On the right, you can see that nationally and in the South, vacancy is far below where it typically has bottomed out in prior cycles. That's also true in Miami, where vacancy is under 3%. It's less true as you head into Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach. Regardless of this, in the aggregate, the metro area as a whole, because Miami does dominate this market from an inventory basis, is still expected to see 6 to 10% rent growth over the next 2 years. And this market tightness is one part of that. What's interesting about South Florida, it does have a little bit of a difference. So this market in total is just under 300 million square feet. So it's a fairly small industrial market from a secondary market viewpoint, right? It's land constrained. You have the Everglades, you have the ocean, you have a huge metropolis. Miami has a huge population. And so demand was actually on par with 2018 levels, very, very strong, robust demand over the next 2 years expected. So cumulatively, the MSA will have absorbed 70 million square feet by the end of 2023 if we go back to the beginning of the GFC recovery. Where Miami also stands out as a metro area, including Fort Lauderdale and Palm Beach, is also on the construction side. Because of those constraints, you can't absorb space that doesn't exist. And vacancy is very, very low, as I showed you on the prior slide. If you were to see this chart nationally, you would find this number is at a record high. And we just see the supply side constraints, rising land costs, competition from other kinds of assets in such a unique geographic space in Miami that we just don't have the space to actually recognize that sort of demand that exists. It doesn't have anywhere to go for the most part. Sticking with this consumer angle, right, with 40% of leasing in industrial being driven by e-commerce, very dependent on the consumer outlook. Regardless of inflation and confidence, consumers are spending. So watch what they do, not what they say. And on the retail side, I think Mark mentioned it's a little surprising. Retail has held up remarkably well, unlike office, where the correction is finally starting to be behind us in some markets, and the new expansion is just starting off, leading sort of in the lead with Florida. Retail actually had positive absorption pretty much all of last year, and vacancy really didn't go up during the pandemic, except for very briefly. So, when you look at retail vacancy that is low at 4% or lower and has either remained flat or compressed since the pandemic began, I think it can just be surprising. And the main point here is most retail is not low-class malls, and most retail is not Soho or High Street Manhattan. Most retail is thriving, and that backdrop, that sort of storyline was lost during the pandemic, and I think investors are really starting to heighten their focus on this. They're also starting to hone in on what's going on with hotel, which is, by the way, nationally occupancy rates last year were on par with the sort of median of what we've experienced since 2000 in expansionary periods. So if you took 2000 to 2019, you stripped out the GFC, and you took what is the median occupancy rate throughout the year, last year was exactly on par with that, and in some months even better. And on top of that, we've seen major RevPAR corrections that have already fully recovered. So if you look at some of Florida, such as Palm Beach and Jacksonville and Miami, were essentially already over what 2019 RevPAR levels were, and we expect to go even further. You can see in the case of Palm Beach, much further, with, not surprisingly, Orlando lagging a little bit behind with its unique concentration economically in the tourist industry. Last but not least, wanted to hit on the capital markets, just put some context around here. We had a record year, and that was driven really by a surprisingly strong December, which was largely a story of the apartment sector in the commercial real estate world. So in 2021, $700 billion of investment sales, that's the largest number ever. We think that number is actually going to grow this year on the back of just record fundraising for real estate, really attractive risk-adjusted returns, the fact that it is an inflation hedge, all of the signs that we watch in terms of fundraising point to another very strong year, despite what is going to go on with the interest rate profile. What we're also seeing is, and this is definitely going to continue this year, is a really big focus on secondary markets. Cap rate spreads between primary and secondary markets have compressed to essentially nothing, to zero. And I would not be surprised to see that inflect given the disparate performance in economic conditions, labor markets, and real estate that exist between our primary gateway cities and our secondary markets. You can see another place where Florida has outperformed even Texas is that it accounts for 3 of the 5 most rapidly growing secondary investment spaces in the U.S. And on a growth rate basis relative to 19 levels, it's ranking even above our larger cities where we tend to see the deepest liquidity. So, for example, South Florida, Miami MSA, 80% above pre-COVID level in terms of investment sales. Again, this was driven primarily by the apartment sector. That is going to shift. So we see this bar as going down a little bit and all of these bars actually going up in 2022 as investors diversify, as they look for yield and the ability to also see capital growth, which is going to happen where cap rates did not compress as much. And this is showing you South Florida's cap rate profile by asset class. And you see that industrial and apartment have compressed significantly. And in 2021, this is with some rising interest rates. Obviously, in 2020, what happened was really more associated with the 10-year, not with the cap rate, which, as you can see, actually declined in that year. In the whole, we think cap rates will remain stable this year, sort of flat because of that interest rate going up, so spreads compressing further. Capital growth is going to be limited. So where do investors look? They look at the income side. And this is really where the improving fundamentals in retail, hotel, and office become more important. There is a big emphasis on Sunbelt office that we're hearing about as investors look for alpha. So I think Florida is poised among these clearly to be an outperformer. You're leading in all kinds of metrics, and that's not going to change. It's just going to be a little bit choppier as we go through an interest rate adjustment and a shift from policy being highly stimulative to a little bit more of a headwind moving forward. So I'm going to hand it back over, but I'll just leave this up here for a few moments. When you get these slides, these are just a few nuggets you can take around, fun facts to kind of share about the outlook for this year, about the South Florida commercial real estate market. Darcy?
Thank you, Rebecca. Wow, a lot of information. And also want to let everybody know that Rebecca's slide presentation will be on the NAIOP website a little later on today. So if you guys want to get back, refresh some of the takeaways, you'll be able to get it on the South Florida NAIOP website. So we do have a few minutes set aside for questions. So again, you can use the Ask Question tab and type in a question, and then Jules will read it out to me. But let me kind of start with the first question. I'm going to throw it, Bittner, are you still with us?
I'm here.
Okay, so I want to talk about something you didn't bring up. And I do see people talking about it, but not as much as they used to. So it's just the U.S. debt. So we've spent trillions of dollars flooding the economy to kind of hedge against the pandemic. So a trillion here, a trillion there. All of a sudden, we're $30 trillion in debt, which is outpacing GDP. Is there a day of reckoning where this is going to actually have to be dealt with, and what would that look like?
Well, I don't know how many folks are from Argentina that are in the audience this morning, but that's kind of the nightmare scenario. One of the issues that we have is that if the Fed's borrowing cost goes up by 1 percentage point from where it is today, that's roughly the cost of the child care tax credit over 10 years. So that's 1 year's interest expense. I mean, that's how much, with $30 trillion in debt, a 1 percentage point increase in our borrowing costs, which is very easy to see because they're very low right now. It's very costly. So, yeah, I do think we're at a bit of a day of reckoning. And one of the ways that we can handle that or make that adjustment to this higher debt level easier is to have higher inflation so that the government's paying back its debt or servicing its debt with cheaper dollars. And I think one of the adjustments that, and this is Mark Vittner, you like me because I'm out there, I tell you things that you don't hear in other places. Inflation's not going back to 2%. That's a fairy tale. It's over. Inflation will average between 3% and 5% over the course of this decade, which will be either the second worst decade for inflation in the history of the country or the worst decade. 4% was 4% what we averaged in the 1980s was the worst that we've ever seen in the history of the country. But inflation is going to be persistent. It is widespread. Inflation expectations. There's three thoughts on inflation. One is that it's a monetary phenomenon. One is Keynesian, that it's demand pulled by the expansion of fiscal policy. And the third is kind of a new Keynesian rational expectations, or rational expectations then to new Keynesian, that it's inflation expectations that matter. Inflation expectations have surged in the last 6 months, even at the Federal Reserve. So, by any measure, inflation is going to be higher. That's how we're going to handle it. So that, you ask if the day of reckoning, there's going to be a day of reckoning. There is, and we're at it.
We're at it. So if we're running at inflation of 3 to 5%, which is going to be the new normal, what tools does the Fed have in its toolbox to address that? I mean, they say interest rates, and they're already low, but they're going to raise them.
They're going to raise them, but I don't think they want to wreck the economy if inflation is 3 to 5%. I don't think they want to wreck. We had a long business cycle in the 1980s. We had a long business cycle in the 1990s when inflation went from 4% to 2%. And so I think they look at it that the adjustment that is yet to be made in the financial markets is that we are going to see higher inflation. It's going to be persistent. And the battle to get it down to below, somewhere between 2 and 3% is probably a 20-year battle, not a 2 or 3 year battle. And so that's not in the market yet. It's probably good for real estate. I think that's why Blackstone's raising as much money as they are. But it's not good for any real estate or all real estate. It's good for well-located real estate. Which
we are in South Florida. We like to think we're well located. Got a lot of sunshine.
As long as the tide's not coming in too much, that's all.
Oh, let's not even get on that one. That's down the road. All right, so let's take a question from our virtual audience. We had one that came in that I'll throw over to, David, to Rebecca. So South Florida has benefited from net migration growth during the pandemic, which has kind of helped us, stay fairly strong and has helped our job base. David wants to know, with the cost of housing rising, whether it's apartments, which you stressed how expensive they are, or single family homes or condos, does this shift the tide in terms of us being a less attractive relocation place because of affordability? Are we going to get to be like a San Francisco?
I think the good news is I don't think that you'll quite get there. That you'll be anywhere near San Francisco or Manhattan. I'm actually a person who left Manhattan during the pandemic, but I relocated to Virginia, not far south enough to make it to Florida. But I think the reality is that two things are going to happen. One is the pace of migration that occurred in 2020 and 2021 will slow down. Migration on a structural basis has been slowing down for the last 50 years. And I think this is a blip in what will otherwise be a trend that generally continues. But what always has been the case is that we tend to see domestic migrants leave big cities, domestic residents net out migrate from large, expensive, especially more northern cities and move south. There's been a Sunbelt migration phenomena since the invention of air conditioning, interestingly enough. And so I think that's going to continue. Where there will be a shift, and this will benefit Miami MSA as well as our larger gateway cities, which have been really hard hit in ways where Miami has not been as hard hit, is the return of international migration. So we don't have an additional 1 million people in this country. Our population and labor force lost out on the benefits of that as a result of the pandemic and really depressed international migration. Miami is very much disproportionately dependent on these arrivals and these migrants coming to the country, just as they are dependent on domestic residents moving from higher cost areas. So that's going to continue. We will start to see an improvement in international migration, but I think at the domestic pace that we've seen is not likely to continue with what we've seen in the last 2 years. That's going to slow down.
So we got another question that came in from our virtual audience, Rebecca, with regards to, and I don't know if you tracked it, further growth in the Space Coast area, which would be north, heading up to Cape Canaveral. Do you think that we're going to see some growth in those parts a little north of South Florida? Will it, the tide lift all boats, so to speak?
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, where we're expecting outperformance across the board are in our Sunbelt markets and in mid-sized cities that are growing rapidly because of the advantages that they bring on a comparative basis to this post-COVID world, which is greater affordability, a lot of space, right, to be able to develop. I mean, South Florida is constrained in that way, but most of our central and more northern Florida markets have the ability to expand more than where they are now. And the cost is very attractive. And what we'll probably see is just a more diverse set of bidders on those kinds of, in the development space just in general. So no, I don't think that as you head north, there's going to be a different story. It's just going to be varying shades of gray around the fastest growth and sort of those that are growing at fairly rapid rates, but just not the fastest.
Great. Let's take one more question. And this one goes out to Mark Bittner from our audience. It says, Mark, could you please clarify your comments about production growing greater than consumption and supply chain still not normalizing for another 5 years?
Yes. And I wanted to make sure that I also sent my Florida, our latest Florida forecast so that you'll have those, post that to
Great.
the website too. But in terms of the production growing faster than consumption, this shift began around September, and but we don't produce all the goods we make, particularly consumer goods. We import a lot of them. That's one of the reasons why the ports are so congested, and the volume of stuff coming into ports is 27% higher than it was pre-pandemic. So it's not as if we have a bunch of sick outs at the port and they can't process the goods. They're having to process a lot more goods than they did previously. So I just don't think we're going to be able to see production get back to where it needs to be here in the U.S. Very quickly. We're seeing a lot of reshoring. For example, we've got a lot of semiconductor plants that are being built, and a lot of them haven't even been sited yet, and they're going to take years to be built. We've got equipment. There's huge backlogs on production of equipment that needs to go into factories to make consumer goods, and so this is something that's going to take years. It's not something that's going to happen in the span of a year. But with production growing faster than consumption, supply chain disruptions are going to improve over the course of the year. So we will see that delivery times will be a little bit shorter a year from now than they are today, but they're still going to be longer than they were prior to the pandemic.
Great. Well, I want to thank our panelists. You guys did a great job. Everything is advertised, rock stars of economic forecasting. I'm going to toss it back to our 2022 president, Christopher Thompson. Come on up.
Darcy, Mark, Rebecca, thank you for your time and insight. You've all given us a lot to think about. I appreciate everyone who's logged in today. We look forward to seeing you all in person. As Mark said, February 1st is going to be the end of COVID. So we are back in person with our first meetings, which should be announced soon. February 17th, the Developing Leaders have a networking event that you will get the email on soon. And we expect to have another event later on in the month. So thank you all for joining us.